We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history. And we have won. It is an atomic bomb.
On August 9th, 1945, 3 days after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, a plane carrying America's second atomic bomb left an American Air Force base in Tinian and headed toward the Japanese city of Kokura. But when they got there, after an hour and a half of circling around, there was a problem. They couldn't see the city. The problem was, the aircraft was running out of fuel. And so they had no other choice but to pick their secondary target. That was the city of Nagasaki.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
First time I got into Nagasaki and saw the horror and the devastation, it was pathetic. You'd be going along streets that were in ruins and buildings crushed as if a massive anvil had fallen down and destroyed them. The poor children were really suffering. They had a lost look, staring at me as if to say, "Who are you? What have you done?"
The atomic bombing of Nagasaki resulted in the loss of over 30,000 civilian lives. Roughly half the city, with its homes, its factories, its historic buildings and churches, were completely destroyed. Now, I could just end the video right here, and I feel like a lot of people would, but I'm not here to tell you the story of how the city of Nagasaki was destroyed. I'm here to tell you the story of how the city was rebuilt. This is the story of a city shaped by history, a story of the amazing people whose dedication, research, and resilience helped rebuild a city from the ashes. A city that stands today as a reminder of the horrors of war, but also as a symbol of peace. This is the story of how they rebuilt the city of Nagasaki.
Nagasaki, viewed from the air, is just one tremendous area of ruin.
Now you're probably wondering, why was Nagasaki even targeted in the first place? Yes, it was a backup target, but it had to have had some kind of strategic importance. Alright, so here's the super quick history. You see, for centuries, Japan was closed to the outside world. Now, Sakoku was a period where basically no one was allowed to enter or leave the country, except for the Dutch? Now, the Dutch were allowed to trade in Japan, but they could only do it from one place, and that place was Nagasaki. Specifically, they could only step foot on this artificial island known as Dejima. This is a photo of what it looked like around the year 1865. You can actually see the Dutch flag flying above, and this is what it looks like today. And for over 200 years, this was the only spot where foreigners were allowed to trade in Japan. Like, if you were caught anywhere other than Dejima, you were. So you can clearly see how important Nagasaki really was when it came to connecting the outside world to Japan. But then, Japan opened its borders, and Nagasaki started to lose its importance since it was no longer the exclusive port city. And then the Japanese were like, what if we start an empire?
The combined fleet of Japan has been on maneuver. And these are the first pictures of that fleet ever passed by the Japanese censor.
Nagasaki became one giant shipyard, and all the Japanese army's ships were starting to be built here. Like, the first Japanese Imperial fleet was built here in Nagasaki. You can actually see the shipyard right over there. Now, the Japanese Navy was strong, and if Nagasaki was building all the ships for this navy, well, that made the city a target. Alright, so question number one. How do you rebuild the city? You see, you can't just rebuild the city. You need money. And Japan didn't have a lot of money. But Nagasaki had the ability to make some, because one of its main industries, its shipyard, wasn't destroyed. You see, the area destroyed by the bomb was up here, an area known as the Urakami district of Nagasaki. Its shipyard was down here and wasn't destroyed by the attacks. So Nagasaki was able to take that sweet tax revenue from the shipping industry and redistribute it to reconstruct the destroyed areas of the city.
貿易再開を控えて、ドックからは土音が高らかに響き、新しい港長崎の行く手を物語っています。
The Urakami district was also a Catholic neighborhood, so the church also sent some monetary aid. And then there was the US military. The US military occupied Nagasaki officially for 1 year and unofficially for another 3. Together, US forces and Japanese workers cleaned up the blast zone. But the US military wasn't there just to rebuild. The goal of the occupation forces in Japan was to ensure compliance with the terms of surrender. In other words, they were there to demilitarize the country. And that meant censorship. Soldiers and locals involved in the cleanup efforts weren't informed of the dangers of being exposed to the radiation during the cleanup. The US occupation forces under Douglas MacArthur enforced a heavy and strict censorship policy. So images taken by Yosuke Yamahara, who had taken horrifying images of the destruction and the people affected by it just 1 day after the attack, were not seen till 7 years later when Life magazine broke the censorship.
I hand carried to the US the negative and a print of the Japanese black and white film. Arrangements were made to screen the Japanese film for the Army, Navy, the Atomic Energy Commission, plus intelligence people. After the screening, I was told that this material could not be released.
Most of the black and white film footage wasn't seen by American audiences till over 20 years later.
What happened to my color footage? I was told by people in the Pentagon that hell no and damn no. They didn't want those images out because they showed effects on man, women, and child. They didn't want the public to know what their weapons had done at a time when they were planning on more bombs.
The color footage you are seeing right now of the destruction was suppressed for over 30 years. I'm mentioning all of this because this act of suppression and the fear of this tragedy being forgotten had a direct impact on the city of Nagasaki's rebuilding. You see, there were two big narratives surrounding the city of Nagasaki's rebuilding. The first was Dr. Nagai's Bells of Nagasaki. Dr. Nagai was a devout Catholic, and during the war, he served in the Nagasaki Medical College Hospital as a radiologist. But when the college was destroyed by the bombing, he suffered terrible injuries. But even so, he and the surviving medical staff chose to stay and dedicate themselves to treating the victims of the bombing. Thankfully, due to Dr. Nagai and a bunch of other people's efforts, we understand the effect of radiation on people's bodies today. However, because of the injuries he had sustained due to the bombing, he became bedridden.
原子の研究に半生を捧げた永井博士は、ウラニウムによって損なわれた病苦に鞭打ち、なお精魂を込めた研究を続けています。
This work he was referring to was his memoir, The Bells of Nagasaki. Dr. Nagai saw the bomb as an act of martyrdom, a tragic yet divine act to bring peace, linking it to Nagasaki's history of Christian persecution and sacrifice. The US really liked this narrative, because in Nagai's narrative, the US wasn't even a factor in the bombing. It was instead a divine act of God. American censors realized the value of Nagai's narrative, and they used it to help frame their own atomic narrative.
If lasting peace cannot be created except by fear of the atom bomb, then let us be afraid.
Which is why Nagai's memoir was one of the first pieces to pass through the censors. But this narrative did not sit well with the second interest group. Enter the atomic bomb survivors. For years after the bombing, the atomic bomb survivors were discriminated against. They were denied employment and medical coverage because of their injuries. And many survivors, especially women, suffered from a widespread false belief that radiation exposure would lead to birth defects. Now, add in the ironclad censorship by the US occupying forces and the decision to demolish and rebuild the Urakami Cathedral, and you can start to see how the atomic survivors felt as though their suffering was actively being suppressed and erased. But they didn't want to be forgotten. They wanted some memory of what happened to them to remain. And fortunately for them, they had an unlikely ally. Enter Colonel Victor E. Delnore, a Lebanese American, the man in charge of Nagasaki's cleanup and reconstruction efforts. Colonel Delnore witnessed firsthand the destruction and discrimination the atomic survivors had suffered, and was one of the loudest voices lobbying Nagasaki's government officials to enshrine the voice of the survivors in the city's future development. Colonel Delnore helped shift the narrative from one of martyrdom to one that also acknowledges the traumatic memory and human suffering caused by the atomic bomb. Now, my goal here is not to say that one of these narratives was better or more valid than the other. It's important to understand that each of these narratives was a way for the survivors to cope with the destruction and pain and suffering that they had experienced. But what makes Nagasaki so unique as a city today is that it was able to combine these narratives to build a city that today stands as a vision for peace. One thing that I really struggle with, however, like when I go to a museum, for example, is I struggle to quantify, like in my mind, I struggle to see how something directly impacted people that happened like a long time ago. Like they'll talk about like, oh yes, like the atomic bomb was like destructive and it cost people a lot of lives, but like I struggle to see it like when I look at a map or something. How do you quantify something like an atomic bomb? Like, how do you imagine such destructive capabilities through a video? Now, I feel like Hiroshima gets a lot of rep because there's a very stark building that shows you how destructive the attack really was. Nagasaki, however, on the other hand, is a lot more subtle in the things that they want to show you. And one of those examples are the atomic trees right behind me.
The penitentiary, 300 meters from the epicenter. The wooden buildings and reinforced concrete walls were destroyed, and over 140 persons, including the inmates, the prison staff, and their families, were instantly killed.
Peace Park was built on the site where the Urakami prison once stood, where tens of thousands of workers were brought over from China, America, Britain, anyone captured during the war, and forced to work in factories for the Japanese army. But when the bomb hit, all those workers perished. There's actually a lot of monuments kind of scattered around the city. Some, like this one right here, are a vision for peace. But some are a harrowing reminder of what happened on that day. Right behind me is the epicenter. It happened just a few kilometers up in the sky, right over there.
By drawing elongated lines from these various points, it was determined that the epicenter was south of the penitentiary, at a point slightly east of the crossroad at Matsuyama-cho.
Another feature of this park is that it contains one of the last remnants of the old Urakami Cathedral. The new one today stands on the hill where the last one once stood. Now, the thing is, it's quite tragic, to see a destroyed building or burnt statue, but those things can be rebuilt. Those who lost their lives will never return. But Nagasaki has something special, because it can show us something amazing. The power of living beings to make a comeback.
Sadno Shrine. The first stone torii archway was not knocked down, but half of the next one was blown down, while the other half remained standing in a precarious position.
When you walk around the city of Nagasaki today, you can see clearly how much this event impacted the surroundings. Like, the attack was so powerful that it basically sheared off one half of the Torii Gate completely through the center.
Extremely powerful pressure was applied for a mere fraction of a moment.
One thing that I find really beautiful, however, is that even till today, people will continue to leave water and drinks for the people who struggle to find water after the attacks. And when you make your way to the shrine entrance, that's when you'll see the atomic tree. There are about 50 or so of these trees that are scattered around the city of Nagasaki today. And you can see the meticulous preservation that goes into keeping these trees alive. I think these trees serve as a beautiful reminder of how resilient life can really be, even in the face of a nuclear attack, and how the people of Nagasaki basically rebuilt the city from the ground up. Today, Nagasaki is a beautiful city home to over 400,000 people, and there is just so much more that I wanted to show you, but I feel there are things you should get to experience for yourself. But one thing I hope you take away from this video is that if you, or someone you know, visits this city in the future, they see that Nagasaki isn't the story of a city where a tragedy once happened. Rather, it's the story of a city and people that overcame it.
そして核軍縮をめぐる国際社会の分断の深まりやロシアによる核の威嚇と核軍縮をめぐる情勢が一層厳しさを増している今だからこそ長崎を最後の被爆地にと世界へ強く訴え続けてまいります。
Are you guys just everywhere?
Like, bro. Are you recording? Yeah.